Welcome, I'm David, and this is Crime Line. Tonight, we delve into an extraordinary case from the United Kingdom that fundamentally challenged an 800-year-old legal principle, the rule against double jeopardy. It's the chilling story of Gary Allen, a man who was acquitted of a brutal murder in 1997 only to be retried and convicted for that same crime more than 2 decades later, alongside a second, eerily similar killing. This landmark case not only brought a calculating predator to justice, but also hinged on a crucial change in UK law and an audacious undercover police operation that captured a stunning confession. Join us as we unravel the twisted path of Gary Allen and the relentless pursuit of justice that rewrote legal history. Our story unfolds primarily in Yorkshire, a vast and historic county in northern England, a region of stark contrasts. From industrial cities to rugged coastlines, the narrative will navigate through towns and cities like Hull, a port city on the River Humber, Grimsby, and Rotherham in South Yorkshire, and even take a significant detour to Plymouth, a port city in Devon, far to the south. It was within these landscapes that Gary Allen, a man whose name appears in early records and transcripts sometimes as Allen, carved a path of violence. The grim saga began on the morning of Sunday, October 26, 1997, around 10:30 a.m. 3 schoolchildren made a horrifying discovery on the bleak, muddy shores of the River Humber, a large tidal estuary known for its busy shipping lanes and sometimes desolate banks. The body of a woman had washed up. Investigators determined her body had been placed in the river at a remote site accessed via an uninviting track called Brickyard Lane. She was found naked from the waist down, a single boot and part of her tights still clinging to one foot. The victim was soon identified as Samantha Class, just 29 years old at the time of her death. Samantha was a mother of 3 young children and a beloved daughter. On the evening before her body was discovered, she had been working as a sex worker in Hull City Centre. Friends in the same vulnerable profession described her as someone not entirely suited for the harsh realities of street work, a gentle soul who, it was often said, never really wanted to do it in the first place. Gary Allen initially told police that on the night of Saturday, October 25th, he had picked up Samantha Class on Porter Street in Hull City Centre in his Ford Escort, a very common and popular car in the UK during that period. He claimed he had agreed to pay her $30 for full sexual intercourse. He stated he had driven to an area near Walker Street, also in Hull, and had engaged in consensual sex with Samantha in his car. His initial version of events then took a self-serving turn. He alleged that the condom he had been using split during the act, causing Samantha to become angry. According to Allen, after putting her stockings and underwear back on, she had simply left his vehicle and walked off unharmed. He vehemently denied causing her any injury. However, Allen's actions in the days immediately following the discovery of Samantha's body were highly suspicious and pointed towards a desperate attempt to cover up potentially incriminating evidence. Most notably, he made immediate arrangements to get rid of his Ford Escort. He initially tried to explain this away by claiming he was frightened, having seen a news report about Samantha's death the day after he had been with her. However, the veracity of this claim was questionable, as there was compelling evidence suggesting Allen had already taken the initial steps to dispose of his car before the first news stories about Samantha's death had even aired on television or been published. Allen would eventually sell his car to scrap dealers for a mere £25 on October 28th, just 2 days after Samantha's body was found. This was a vehicle that had been registered as recently as October the 3rd, less than a month earlier, and for which he had paid 50p. The precipitous rush to get rid of the car for half its recent purchase price was, to say the least, deeply suspicious and suggested a man eager to eliminate evidence. The forensic evidence painted a brutal picture. It indicated that Samantha's body had been dragged from a car to the point where it was eventually placed in the cold waters of the Humber. The official cause of death was determined to be strangulation by a ligature, a cord, rope, or similar item used to constrict the neck, a method often indicative of intense personal violence. A staggering 33 distinct injuries or groups of injuries were noted on her body by the pathologist. One particularly telling injury to her arm was consistent with having been inflicted by the tire of a car, strongly suggesting she had been deliberately driven over after being assaulted. Massive internal injuries were also documented. The pathologist, Dr. Ruddy, provided an overall horrifying conclusion. Samantha Class had been the victim of a savage blunt force assault, following which she was strangled to death with a ligature. And then, in a final act of brutality or an attempt to ensure her death, she had been run over by a vehicle. Dr. Ruddy estimated that the time of death was possibly prior to midnight on October 25th, the night she was with Allen, but conceded it may have occurred later. No obvious signs of male DNA were found in her underwear, which was recovered from the scene. However, semen from 2 different men was found in her body. One of these men readily came forward and admitted to having been with Samantha some days before her death. He was quickly and definitively excluded from police inquiries. The second man whose DNA was present remained unidentified, that is, until Gary Allen was arrested for an entirely unrelated drunk driving offense in July 1998. At this time, as per standard procedure, his DNA was taken by police and entered into the National DNA Database. Gary Allen's DNA profile was a direct match to the other, previously unidentified, semen sample found on Samantha's body. Furthermore, the forensic scientist's expert opinion was that Samantha's underwear had not been put back on after her most recent sexual intercourse. This finding was significant, as it had a direct bearing on the circumstances of her death and starkly contradicted Allen's initial claims that she had dressed and walked away unharmed. Adding to the mounting circumstantial evidence, investigators discovered that Gary Allen was intimately familiar with the desolate area where Samantha's body was found. He had lived on Brickyard Lane with his aunt when he was just 16 years old. Despite the key piece of physical evidence, Allen's Ford Escort, the vehicle likely present at the crime, being unfortunately unavailable for detailed forensic examination due to its quick disposal, the police firmly believed they had their man. Gary Allen was arrested for the murder of Samantha Class on November 17, 1998. He would be interviewed by police 5 times as the case against him was meticulously built. During these interviews, he eventually admitted to having picked up Samantha that fateful evening for sex. But despite this admission, the strong DNA link, and the other mounting pieces of circumstantial evidence pointing directly toward his guilt, the jury at his trial at Sheffield Crown Court was not, it seemed, entirely convinced they could convict him beyond all reasonable doubt. Gary Allen, a man described by some as a plausible liar, was said to have effectively manipulated his way through the trial. In January 2000, in a verdict that shocked and dismayed investigators and Samantha's family, he was acquitted of the murder of Samantha Class. Local press commentary contemporaneous to the crime had chillingly described Allen as a dangerous psychopath with a profound and disturbing aversion to women. Similarly, a later academic book written on sex work and violence in the UK would quote the stark assessment that police and criminal experts were making about Allen. Even at that time, a warning had been circulated to sex workers in the region, stating clearly that Gary Allen was a dangerous individual who would likely attack as soon as he was asked for money. This apt and terrifying assessment of his character and modus operandi would, tragically and horrifically, bear out in the subsequent years. In February 2000, a free man despite the heavy cloud of suspicion that still hung over him, Gary Allen relocated from the north of England to Plymouth, a historic port city in Devon, located in the far southwest of the country. Chillingly, a pattern of violence soon re-emerged. 2 brutal attacks occurred in Plymouth shortly after Allen's arrival, one in March and another in April of that same year. These attacks bore horrifying and unmistakable similarities to what had happened to Samantha Class nearly 3 years earlier. They were brutal, unprovoked assaults upon female sex workers, and both involved attempted strangulation. The first of these Plymouth assaults took place on March 29th, less than 35 days after Allen had walked free from Sheffield Crown Court, acquitted of Samantha's murder. He approached a woman who was working as a sex worker in Plymouth, requested oral sex, and she agreed. However, once they were in a secluded area, he suddenly and violently grabbed the woman's neck, crushing her throat and forcefully pulling her to the ground. He furiously demanded that he should not be charged money for any sexual activity. He then repeatedly punched her in the head, restrained her on the floor, and cruelly pushed his hand into her mouth in an apparent attempt to silence her. During this terrifying attack, he chillingly called her the scum of the earth. This violent episode only came to an end when Allen was unexpectedly interrupted by a member of the public who happened upon the scene, causing him to flee. The woman was left deeply terrified, with significant injuries to her mouth and extensive bruising and scratches to her face. Just a couple of weeks later, again in Plymouth, Allen approached a second woman who was working as a prostitute in the city's red light district. When she prudently requested payment up front, he immediately became violent. He viciously put his arm around her neck and squeezed her throat with the crook of his elbow, attempting to strangle her. He then dragged her backwards, simultaneously putting his hand over her mouth and forcing his fingers down her throat to stop her from screaming. Allen punched her in the head repeatedly before finally running off, this time following the timely arrival of police officers who had been alerted to the assault. Gary Allen was quickly located and charged with both of these violent assaults. On September 21st, 2000, he was convicted by a jury of indecent assault and assault occasioning actual bodily harm. On December 8th of the same year, he was sentenced to 5 years and 6 months imprisonment. Significantly, with an extended license period, a form of supervised release similar to parole in the U.S. of 4 years and 6 months upon his eventual release. Allen was, in fact, released on license twice during this particular sentence. In 2003, during a routine interview with his assigned probation officers, part of the UK Probation Service's ongoing role in managing and supervising offenders both in the community and in custody, Gary Allen spoke with a disturbing and chilling openness about his mindset and his motivations. The experienced probation officers reported that he spoke frankly and without remorse about his strong, visceral dislike, even hatred, of prostitutes, contemptuously describing them as scum and the lowest of the low. In a series of horrifying admissions, Gary Allen confessed to these probation officers that he had meticulously planned and subsequently committed both of the brutal attacks on the prostitutes in Plymouth. He chillingly stated that he specifically targets prostitutes because, in his deeply warped and misogynistic view, they go with anybody and are therefore easy targets. He then uttered words that sent profound shivers down the spines of the seasoned officers. "I just want to hurt people. I can't tell you how far. I can't tell you what I want to do to them. I enjoy thinking about it. I get pleasure from the thinking. I just really enjoy different types of violence." During his time in custody for these assaults, he categorically and outrightly refused to participate in any form of rehabilitation programs or any sex offender treatment programs offered to him. Numerous psychiatric reports compiled during this period of incarceration consistently concluded that Gary Allen possessed an extremely high and ongoing risk of serious sexual reoffending. He also brazenly told the probation service that the attacks he committed in Plymouth would have been far worse, far more injurious, had he not been disturbed on both occasions. He even callously stated that he had not inflicted as much injury as he had originally intended, offering the excuse that he had been drunk at the time of the assaults. He expressed absolutely no remorse whatsoever for his violent actions or for the trauma he had inflicted upon his victims. Following his eventual release from prison after serving his sentence for the Plymouth assaults, Gary Allen, a man now clearly identified by authorities as a highly dangerous sexual sadist, returned once again to the Humberside area of Yorkshire. The police in Humberside, understandably and deeply concerned by Allen's presence back in their community, given his horrific history, his chilling admissions to probation, and the lingering, profound suspicions surrounding his involvement in Samantha Class's unsolved murder, decided to take proactive and extraordinary measures. They commenced a sophisticated, resource-intensive, and lengthy undercover police operation, codenamed Operation Misty. This highly sensitive operation was tasked with a critical dual purpose. Firstly, to try and gather new, irrefutable evidence to prove or disprove, once and for all, that Gary Allen was in fact responsible for the 1997 death of Samantha Class, regardless of his previous jury trial acquittal. And secondly, and perhaps more urgently, to protect both vulnerable sex workers in the region and the general public from any potential future violent attacks that authorities strongly believed Allen was highly likely to commit. Operation Misty, an operation that would involve highly regulated and carefully managed UK undercover policing techniques, would eventually produce more than 400 hours of secret audio and video recordings, all meticulously aimed at gathering definitive evidence against him. A significant portion of these recordings were made by Allen's new friend, a man known to him only as Ian. Ian was, in reality, a highly trained and experienced undercover police officer, skillfully playing the role of a fellow criminal. Gary Allen first met Ian on October 19, 2010, approximately 6 months after Allen had been released from prison for the Plymouth assaults. Ian's carefully crafted cover identity was that of an experienced, hardened criminal who was supposedly on the run from other, even more dangerous, criminals after having seriously wounded a rival in a violent gang dispute. Over a period of months, Ian patiently and skillfully cultivated a friendship with Allen, gaining his trust and confidence. Then, on December 6, 2010, in a secretly recorded conversation that would prove to be pivotal, Gary Allen, believing he was confiding in a fellow criminal, a kindred spirit, confessed to his new friend, Ian, that he had indeed murdered Samantha Class back in 1997. "Well, I'll tell you the truth," Allen began, his chilling words captured on tape for posterity by the hidden recording devices. "Well, you're probably not going to want to know me afterwards, but if you want to know, I'll tell you. The truth of the matter is, years ago when I was depressed, I had sex with prostitutes. And I had sex with this prostitute one night and the condom split. And she said, blah, blah, blah. If you don't pay me, I want your name and I want your address. And if you pay me money and everything else, I'm going to tell the police you raped me. So I strangled her, and I dumped her in the Humber. So, yeah. I went to Sheffield Crown Court. I got found not guilty." Later, in the recordings, he reiterated his guilt with even more chilling candor. "That thing with that Samantha Class, as I said, I told you about that. What happened there? The condom split and she said, well, if you don't give me this, that, and the other, and if you don't start giving me money in that, I'm going to tell the police you raped me, and I just flipped and I killed her and dumped her. But that's just the way I was then." Gary Allen would later, predictably and self-servingly, insist that these damning confessions, so clearly captured on tape by Operation Misty, were simply not true. He conveniently claimed that all the incriminating statements he had made on these recordings, not only about the killing of Samantha Class, but also about various house burglaries he'd allegedly committed and about assaulting police officers, were all complete and utter fabrications. When asked by investigators, and later in court, why he would make up such horrific and detailed stories, He glibly and unconvincingly responded, "I just wanted to pass myself off as criminally minded." The BBC, in its later reporting on the case, noted that Allen claimed he was simply trying to big himself up in an effort to impress his new, supposedly hardened criminal friend. Ian. He just wanted to sound like a tough, experienced criminal, or so he would later assert in his defense. It is somewhat unbelievable, almost beyond comprehension, given this long and sordid series of disturbing events: Allen's initial acquittal for murder, his subsequent convictions for extremely violent assaults on other vulnerable women, his chilling admissions to probation officers about his sadistic enjoyment of violence, and now his detailed confession to an undercover officer that Gary Allen once again found himself a free man, walking the streets during Christmas time of 2018. At this time, Allen was living in Rotherham, a large former industrial town located in South Yorkshire. It was there, in this new setting, that he would tragically meet his next victim, Alina Gerlakova. Allen was now 45 years old. Alina was 38 and originally from Slovakia. She had moved to South Yorkshire in 2008 with her husband and their 4 children, likely as part of the wave of Eastern European migration to the UK following EU expansion. Her children, at the time of her death, ranged in age from 12 to 19. Alina, sadly, was at a very low and vulnerable point in her life. She had separated from her family and was reportedly struggling with excessive drinking and drug use. To feed her addiction, she had tragically become involved in sex work, offering herself to different men in return for drink, money, and sometimes even just a place to shelter for the night. Allen and Alina had initially met in the summer of 2018. Following that first meeting, she had visited his flat on a number of occasions. Allen had engaged in sexual activity with her and had given her drink and other items in return. The last time that Alina Gerlakova would be seen alive was late in the evening of December 26, 2018, Boxing Day in the UK. That was on the same day that she had reportedly visited Allen's flat, apparently uninvited. An intrusion which Allen, by his own recorded words, clearly did not appreciate. The heated, aggressive, and profanity-laced argument that ensued between them as he tried to eject her from his home was captured in chilling detail on the ongoing secret police recordings from Operation Misty. "Get the fuck out of my flat, or I'm going to chuck you out." "Get out," I said. "Get out of my life, Alina." "I didn't ask you to come here. And Alina, if you knock on my door again, I'm coming out of here and I'm going to beat the fuck out of you, and I'm not fucking kidding." Allen was heard shouting, his voice filled with rage. Alina's body was discovered over 3 months later, in April 2019, in a desolate, overgrown area of Rotherham. She was found partially buried and naked. Her head had been forced into an unnaturally extended position, and her private area was disturbingly exposed. Gravel or grit had been placed over parts of her body, along with some stones, a crude and desperate attempt by Allen to cover and conceal her from discovery. The subsequent investigation established that he had twice visited the remote area where her body was eventually found in the 3 months before its discovery, likely returning to check on his gruesome handiwork or to ensure it remained hidden. Alina's body was in a high state of decomposition when it was finally discovered by a member of the public. Nevertheless, after careful and meticulous examination by the pathologist Dr. Ma Carter, it was tragically clear that Alina Gerlakova had also died from a catastrophic neck injury. She had been strangled, just as Samantha Class had been over 2 decades earlier. The pattern was horrifyingly consistent. Gary Allen was, of course, arrested and would stand trial for Alina Gerlakova's murder. As this new trial date approached, prosecutors in the UK, armed with the powerful new confession evidence from Operation Misty, made a historic and bold legal move. They decided to finally seek what they believed was true justice for Samantha Class as well. They applied to the Court of Appeals, arguing that Gary Allen's previous acquittal for Samantha's 1997 murder should be quashed, overturned, and that a retrial should be ordered. They sought to have Gary Allen tried for the death of Samantha Class, alongside the more recent murder of Alina Gerlakova, presenting both cases to a single jury. This was a significant and legally complex undertaking. Gary Allen had stood accused before a jury of his peers in the Samantha Class case once already. He had been tried and acquitted. Prosecutors were now, in effect, asking for a do-over, a chance to try him again for the same crime. Was this something that should, or even legally could, happen? In the United States, the Double Jeopardy Clause of the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution is a fundamental cornerstone of the American justice system. It is designed to protect citizens from being repeatedly prosecuted by the power of the government for the exact same offense, recognizing the inherent imbalance in resources and power between the state and an individual defendant. However, the law in England and Wales relating to double jeopardy underwent a significant and historic amendment in 2003 as part of the wide-ranging Criminal Justice Act. This landmark legislative reform, for the first time in over 800 years of English legal tradition, permitted retrials in respect of a number of very serious offenses, including murder, if and only if new and compelling evidence has come to light that was not available or adduced at the original trial, and, critically, if the Court of Appeals deems a retrial to be firmly in the broader interests of justice. Previously, English common law had strictly and unequivocally prohibited a person who had been acquitted or convicted of an offense from ever being retried for that same offense. The central premise of this historic change in 2003 was that if truly new, substantial, and compelling evidence is brought forward, such as definitive DNA testing that wasn't previously possible, or, as in Gary Allen's extraordinary case, an outright, credible, and secretly recorded confession by the previously acquitted defendant, then the interest of the public, and of justice itself, are best served by appealing for a retrial. This allows the legal system to finally seek and, hopefully, achieve the justice and the long-awaited closure that the victims' families and friends so profoundly deserve. Upon the appeal by the Crown Prosecution Service, the Court of Appeals in England made its momentous decision regarding Gary Allen. They ruled that it was indeed in the interests of justice for a retrial to take place in the unique and compelling circumstances of this specific case, based primarily on the new and exceptionally compelling confession evidence that had been obtained through the diligent work of Operation Misty. The Court of Appeals stated that in order to preserve the integrity and fairness of the criminal justice system, given what appeared to be an unequivocal admission of guilt by the previously acquitted defendant, Gary Allen, a retrial was not only permissible but necessary. It was necessary, they concluded, to establish whether there had been a profound and intolerable injustice to the deceased, Samantha Class, and to her surviving family. And so, in June 2021, after a grueling and intensely emotional 7-week trial at Sheffield Crown Court, a new jury, presented with the evidence of both murders, found Gary Allen guilty of killing both Alina Gerlakova in 2018 and in that historic retrial made possible by the change in the double jeopardy law, Samantha Class back in 1997. After the long-awaited guilty verdict for Samantha's murder, one of her children, her daughter Sophia, bravely told the BC News Service that the death of her mother nearly a quarter of a century earlier had left her and her family broken into pieces. She lovingly remembered Samantha as caring, gentle, and strong. It had taken 24 long and agonizing years for Sophia and the rest of her family to finally receive their justice. At Allen's sentencing hearing, the presiding judge highlighted the profound and lifelong grief that his heinous crimes had caused, telling Allen directly, The profound and lifelong grief which has been caused to them by your wicked murder of their mother, their wife, their sister, or their daughter is almost palpable. Gary Allen was then given a sentence of imprisonment for life, with a minimum term of 37 years before he could even be considered for parole. The case of Gary Allen is a stark and compelling illustration of the inherent fallibility of any human justice system. The terrifying potential for a dangerous predator to evade accountability, sometimes for many years, and the profound importance of legal reforms that allow for truth and justice to ultimately prevail, even after decades have passed. It also underscores the incredible dedication, patience, and innovative methods employed by law enforcement agencies in relentlessly pursuing cold cases and bringing even the most cunning and manipulative killers to justice. Thank you for joining me on Crime Line. The principle of double jeopardy stands as a vital safeguard against state overreach. But as this extraordinary case from the UK demonstrates, the pursuit of justice sometimes requires a courageous re-examination of even our most ancient and entrenched legal traditions, especially when new and compelling truths finally emerge from the darkest of shadows. We'll see you for our next story.